And we are live for another episode of White Noise. I am Chris Stewart, better known and guilty of being Citizen Stewart online on Twitter. Tonight, I have two guests with me because the White Noise show is about me gaining greater understanding from people who have different views on the things that I rant and care about. And so White Noise is a space for that to happen. And it's also a place for me to bring questions that I have for white people that I don't ever get a safe place to say, hey, what do you guys think about such and such? And, just kind of put it on the table and get a good answer back. So that's my setup for the night for the show. For those of you who are watching, thank you for joining us. I'm going to pass it over to my friend and educator and doctor and doctorate T person from Atlanta, Jay Wamstead. Jay, welcome and lead us in, man. Let's make this happen.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jen, for being here. So yeah, first off, let's just say I love social media when it's used right, because this wouldn't be happening without social media. I never would have known who Chris Stewart was or Jenn Binnis, and I certainly never would have been sitting here talking to them. So I'm so excited to get to kind of sharpen our ideas and bounce some stuff off each other. So here's the genesis of how we got here with Jen tonight. I'll introduce her in a moment and let her say a little word too. Last week, Chris Stewart, he just spoke, posted an article about Nikole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project, some breaking news that I'll come back to in a moment. And that article generated some comments, and people were commenting back and forth. And then a Twitter friend of mine shot me a message and said, hey, Jay, you should check out, Chris is taking on Nikole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project over in his feed. You should go look. Chris, so you're famous that way.
Infamous. Okay.
And I did go look, and I went and found the post, and I read the article that he posted. He'll pull it up in a minute. Chris, you could pull that original socialist article up so we can get it in a second.
Okay.
And I saw in all the comments Jenn Binnis, who I would call a Twitter friend, meaning I follow her, and I love reading her posts, and I love seeing what she does and what her take is on things. And so I decided I was going to enter into this 1619 Nikole Hannah-Jones project, even though I don't have an incredible dearth of knowledge, but that's never stopped me before. So I just kind of stuck my nose in there. I know I have a dearth of knowledge. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I have a bit of a lack in all this, but I just stuck my nose in there, and Chris responded to me, and Jennifer responded to him, and Chris responded to her, and Jennifer responded to him, and I went and got dinner. And next thing I know, I had a message from Chris that said, hey, we should have Jen on White Noise to talk about this. And I said, awesome. And so let me tell you about Jen. First off, if you're on Twitter, you should absolutely be following Jenn Binnis. It's Jennifer Binnis, I think, on Twitter. It's easy to find. And
it's actually Jenn Binnis.
I'm sorry. I am so sorry. It's Jenn Binnis. Thank you. And she, as far as I can tell right now, she is the editor and possibly the co-founder of an organization that I'm going to ask her to tell us a little bit more about, called School Marm Advisor, where they do consultant work in historical and editorial and all things related to education writings, education writers, education projects. She is way more qualified to talk about 1619 than me, so I'm so thrilled she's here to take Chris on. I appreciate that.
Wow.
She is awesome though, because she has classroom experience. She has consultant experience. She has a master's degree from the Peabody University at Vanderbilt, which is a big deal if you know anything about education schools. I know, Chris, you disdain them, but some of us know that that's a big deal. And she also has coursework at the doctoral level. She has publications. She has conferences. She's got it all, Chris. So this is gonna be fun. So, Jen, so before we talk about the World Socialist article, and sure, I'm gonna turn it over to Chris. Jen, tell us just a little bit about School Marm Advisor.
Sure. So about 8 months ago, after 15 years of doing professional development with teachers, I help teachers on curriculum, write assessments, do audits, a whole kind of wide spread of things in professional development. I realized I was wasting teachers' time. And the things that teachers were leaving their classrooms to do with me wasn't what they wanted to be doing or what was the best use of their time. So I started to plan an exit out of professional development. And I founded School Mom Advisors, and I've been doing kind of as a side favor for friends for about a decade, just giving feedback. Hey, could you read this for me? Could you give me your thoughts on this? And so now I do it full time. So I work with professors. I follow a pay what you can system for, especially right now during the pandemic, for primary caregivers who find they need proofreading, final editing, research, stuff like that. So it's mostly trying to help people polish their words and get them ready for publication.
Awesome. Wow. Okay. Well, it's fascinating stuff. You should check out their website. And again, if you don't follow Jenn on Twitter, you should, because just about everything that comes out of her feed is awesome.
I have very strong opinions on many things.
Yes. Well, I love all the opinions. So, yeah. So Chris, let's pull up that article that you posted, the World Socialist one. And then I'm going to turn it over to you to critique it before just let me give a little bit of background. So first, apparently last week, or at some point in the past couple weeks, the New York Times has changed some wording on the 1619 Project website. All right. And hopefully Chris can find it, but I'm just going to tell you the wording they changed. Apparently seems to be, they changed this kind of key phrase. Yeah, that's the article. They changed this phrase that the aim of the 1619 Project is to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding, which was a very objectionable thing to a lot of people. And they changed this phrasing now to be the 1619 Project is an ongoing initiative. It aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. This is a very, I think, probably necessary softening of the language given the blowback. I think the controversy seems to be that they did it without any announcement. And also now that it's been discovered, they really haven't talked about it as far as I can tell, which is also interesting. I will say I was at the website today, and Chris, I'm about to turn it over to you. And there is a button that says, if you want to know more about the 1619 Project, click here. All right. And if you click there, it says this quote: the goal of the 1619 Project is to reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. So they're still pushing that founding agenda, which I think is very warranted, but they are doing it on the second page of the project instead of the first page. And that is news, I guess, because it is was kind of done in secret and without any kind of publicity. And then Nicole Hannah-Jones had some Twitter controversies with it. But I'm going to turn us to Chris right now.
Could I rudely slide in before we do that?
No, jump in.
So one of the other services that I offer is fact checking. And fact checking in education is very, very different than fact checking in many other fields, because it's about claim and supporting evidence. So one of the tensions with that socialist article is the 1619 Project is massive. There are, at least by my count, 5 different documents that from the New York Times that contextualize the project. So if you pull from this piece, it will look different than this piece. So it's one of the tensions is they'll say, oh, this changed, but they're pulling it from a different document, if that makes sense. So they're not comparing apples to apples, they're comparing apples to an avocado.
Okay.
So it looks like it changed, but the avocado is still the same. The apple has just been slightly, part of the apple has been changed. Okay. That makes sense.
And well, let me ask a question about that, though. Jenn, you are Jenn, right? Not Jenn or Jennifer. Okay,
I'm Jenn.
Okay. All right. So, Jenn, let me ask you a question about, you just said there's a difference between the fact checking of, what were the 2 groups you said? Like historians and...
well, between, when an educator writes something. So I'm in the headspace of curriculum. So when you fact check curriculum, it's different than if you fact check an article about car repair or the history of something.
So I think that that's really important, because I think that there are different rules that apply to their. First of all, there's a lot of actors involved in this drama that we're talking about right now. So there's a piece of work that comes out from New York Times. The 1619 Project is a piece of work, and that work is consumed by different lenses from people using different lenses. So Jenn, you bring this education fact-checking lens to it. There's also a historian, more than I would have ever known before I dug in on this particular problem myself. Historians have a very much more robust, disciplined way of fighting about these things than I've ever seen, and the way that they consider what's a fact and what's not, and what's history and what's a primary source and all that was pretty interesting to me, just as a student of it, like to watch how they fight. There's also another wrinkle, though. There's also the journalism wrinkle, which I'm actually more familiar with, and facts mean something to an institution like the New York Times. It's like it's actually, they're in the business of facts. So fact checking for them is much different than it would be for me and my view of these things than almost any other enterprise, because it's their core business.
Yeah.
It would be like attacking Amazon on cardboard, right? Like, like if you took cardboard out of the game for Amazon, they just don't exist anymore, because really Amazon's in the cardboard business. I don't know. That's a little commentary. That's a stretch. That's a little bit of a commentary stretch, but go ahead, Jay.
Well, I was gonna say so I want to talk, because I know you have some problems. Not you, like there's a lot of problems with people have problems with the facts of the 1619 Project. But I'd just like to tie a little bow on this World Socialist website article, which has been like, I don't know if it was the first, but it certainly is one of the more thorough out there, and it's everywhere now. It's been picked up all over the place, and like the New York Post is running a different op-ed about it every day. They're like obviously thrilled to impugn Hannah Jones. And so Jen, I just want to kind of tie a bow on this. Would you say that, and you can read out there that Nicole Hannah Jones has deleted all her tweets, hiding from and that's not true. All her, there's 18,000 tweets there. So can you just tie a bow on this for us? Would you say that the change in wording on the splash page of the New York Times is kind of a non-news story?
Non-news story. And I think one of the things I might advocate for is that if we're going to talk about the 1619 Project, I'd advocate we talk about the 1619 Project. Yeah. The Nicole Hannah Jones, one of the tensions is a whole bunch of the stuff that's coming out just seems filled with such a desire to catch her doing something wrong. It seems so focused on what one woman says and not the project. And so part of what I was hoping we could do tonight is explore kind of the timeline of the rollout of the project. And there was a pivot where it went hyper-focused on Nicole and lost sight of the project. So what I'd love to do is just kind of, if we could, just kind of not use her name and focus on the project.
Okay.
And I don't know, Chris, if you're comfortable with that, or if you see them as intertwined because of the journalism aspect, or are you comfortable setting aside Miss Hannah Jones?
It's hard for me in a couple of ways to do that. And I'll just tell you why, and you can tell me whether this is fair or not. So one of the reasons, it's because I believe in storytelling, and in storytelling you have actors, you have dramas and acts. And if I had to if I had to rewrite this as a story, I would have to talk about the actors and what they were motivated by. I don't know if either you guys do screenwriting or have any background in screenwriting, but you're often looking for what motivates the character in the scene. So you're saying, character A wants this by the end of the scene. Character B wants that by the end of the scene. And for me, this is a really rich and contextual set of actors fighting each other, right? And having an intellectual fight with each other. And it's not to personalize it to Nicole, but Nicole is a central figure at the driving of the drama around the project, behind the project. It'd be hard to talk about it without that context, but you can do it. So I can tell you some of my problems
Chris,
are about the project, and some are about Nicole, just about the way she has handled the actors. And I just want to be real clear, because I sent both of you guys a video that I did my best attempt to make my beefs brief in that video, and it didn't work. I could have went on and on and on. But if you can see, I have beef with way more actors than just her in this thing, right? Go ahead, Jay.
Well, I was gonna say, Chris, let's take your you sent Jen and I 3 points ahead of time. And as far as I can tell, Nicole Hannah Jones her name isn't in those points. So I'd love for you to kind of elucidate those 3 points. You can either do them all three at once right now, and we'll kind of take them one by one, or if you want to just go one and whatever you want to do. But your 3 points that you sent to us were not about Nicole Hannah Jones. They were about the 1619 Project, which I think is Jen's point, that we want to stay focused on that to the best we can. Do you have those? You want me to read your quote?
I can pull them real quick because I have 18 points. I tried to narrow them down for you guys. Let me say this. So yes, let's do that. I think that's a good track to do, because if I do that, then I can quickly just say those, and then you guys can deal with them as you see fit and help me see kind of like the errors of my ways, right? The way I might be seeing this. But I will say this, in the video that I sent you guys that I walked through, I have a problem with the socialists' take on what she's done. Some of, a point here or there they may have hit, but I think they missed on many. And by socialist, I mean, Adolph Reed is like an academic who is far to the left. He's a Bernie level guy. And it goes all the way from him to Ben Shapiro, right? Like, I mean, from left to right. And I have a problem with all of their analysis of what they're saying about it. And I take her side on multiple points against what they're coming after her project for. So I just want to put that out there because we're not going to have a chance for everybody to look at that and see I have a more broad kind of problem with everything that they're saying. But anyways, my 3 points. What are the 3 points that I gave you guys? Because I'm looking like right now.
You sent us an email last night where you had 3 points.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let me see if I can find what those were, because I also sent you guys a bunch of links, right?
Yes, it was the same email. You just had 3 points somewhere in the email.
Okay.
So while you're looking for those, one of the things
you go ahead.
I want to actually go to your the point of how we come together today, which is how does the 1619 project intersect with education? And what are the implications of that? I think is perhaps the overriding sort of conversation. And so one of the things that I want to kind of make sure that I put out as a claim is at no point does the 1619 project claim to be a history project. It is a project that is based in a magazine, a New York Times magazine. So it doesn't at any point say we're writing history curriculum. It doesn't claim to be telling the history of these United States. It is telling a history of these United States. So I think part of it is that we have to keep remembering that it is a giant project with 18 different essays, 13 creative pieces of work, 6 podcast episodes. It's a massive project, and we lose so much when we narrow it to just one piece. So I might keep bringing in other parts of the project.
Okay, well, let's just say this, and I found it, and I apologize. I see that you had responded to my email when I didn't respond. Yeah, and we might have to recover some of the things that you've already said here. Okay, so let me say this. When I think about the 1619 project, I am thinking of it as a total piece of work. I am thinking of it through which lens it is supposed to be. Is it a work of journalism? Is it a work of history, like historian level work? Or is it a work of art? In my video about it, I landed on the fact that I think it's a work of art. And as a work of art, I appreciate it. I really like, then if you just put it through that lens and that frame, because I understand as somebody who has written drama and has, and is really a student of writing things that make people inspired or feel something, thematic things. Now I'm a fan, right? So my problem with 1619 is not about the quality of the work. It's not about the number of pieces or how they're aligned together. And as a matter of fact, I'm more of a fan of that part of it. The multimedia, use of multimedia, a podcast, text writing, even music in some places, music video in some places, and graphics. So graphic art. So in that way, we're good. But when you start making it a work of history and it becomes a curriculum of any sort, and then it gets into schools not vetted, is when I start thinking now we're going to have a culture war, because you and I may have differences about what we think our kids need to know about a history and what story we should be telling. So I'll just say one more quick point about that part. As a former school board member, that raises my flags real quick, because we went through a bunch of this stuff with like the textbook makers catering to Texas and catering to California and markets other than ours. Like we're in flyover country and having very little say in what they could ship us. So when we did, for instance, history adoptions, math adoptions, social studies adoptions, science adoptions, those were pretty rigorous processes that required us to answer a lot of different masters in our community. The idea that anybody, right wing or left wing, would have waltzed anything into our schools on something so important as this. We've had, like in Minneapolis, no less in my time of watching this, no less than probably about 5 or 6 major fights that kicked curriculum out of the district completely. And some of it really hostile, really racist in some cases. So
gonna interrupt, and I've decided we're gonna take your points one at a time because I know Jenn has experience and thoughts about the curriculum, specifically that aspect of
point 3.
Yeah, and so like we'll come back to point 1 and 2, which you skipped, just to be fair.
Okay.
But let's take point 3 right now and let Jenn kind of respond to that, because I am one thing here. I'm just a teacher. I am just an 8th grade math teacher.
Never say just a teacher, man. Never say I'm just a teacher. That's more than what I am.
And I can tell you,
PhD teacher. Go for it, man.
And my PhD is in white people. Like my knowledge of curriculum is very limited. I can tell you hilarious stories about textbook adoptions, but not from either the point of view of y'all. So I'd like to go to Jenn and get her to respond to you.
So the first thing that I think New York Times said in several different places, in several different ways, the Pulitzer curriculum is not a history curriculum. It is meant to supplement existing curriculum. And when you look at the Pulitzer curriculum, the first thing, the curriculum that goes with the Nicole Hannah-Jones essay says, print out a copy of the Declaration of Independence. So it says to students, as you read Nicole, it does paired text. As you read Nicole Hannah-Jones' essay, read the Declaration of Independence. And it asks them to do questions like, wow, where did you learn about slavery? And what is your understanding of the slavery? And it asks the question, I think, so Chris, I did watch your video and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I appreciated the way you kept framing the different arguments against the project. The big idea of the 1619 project, as I understand it, is what are the implications if we think of 1619 as the creation of these United States? What are the implications of that? And we have the option. Thinking of our creation as starting at 1619, we are thinking about a moment of trauma. We're thinking about an African foot pressing onto the sand on a beach in Virginia. We are thinking of someone torn from their family. We are thinking of whether they are an indentured servant, whether they were enslaved. We're thinking of this person taken from their home. And that's the start of generations, that 50-year period that builds into chattel slavery, that builds the structure for enslavement of human beings. Or do we think of the creation of our country as this moment when this group of men got together and said, you know what, we're going to stand on our own 2 feet and we're going to be our own nation? Are we a moment of trauma, or are we about a moment of liberation? But asking that question, I think, is what the 1690 Project invites students to do in the curriculum. So the curriculum doesn't say, here is the answer. It literally says, how does the story change if? So everything in the Pulitzer curriculum, as far as I can see, is an invitation to students, not an answer. So the issue of things being vetted, there's nowhere in here about the causes of the revolution. It doesn't appear in any of the curriculum because they don't make those claims. And more importantly, it asks students to analyze texts. It says, read this text by this author. What do you notice? Take a look at the Declaration of Independence. What structure do you see? Where is the space for Black Americans in the Declaration? Where are women in the Declaration? So I hear your concern about the fear of it being adopted, about it being vetted, but I want to assure you that as someone who spent, almost 2 decades doing curriculum design with teachers, the way this is written, it's inquiry curriculum. It is not history curriculum. It is not giving students an answer. It's inviting them to consider what would happen if. So in that sense, I feel comfortable defending the curriculum if teachers choose to use it, because it does structure how do we reconcile that tension. It doesn't offer answers. So for your third question, Chris, I'm comfortable with this curriculum. Mm-hmm. I think this curriculum is just an invitation. It's not an answer. And I think that's a good thing for students to experience, is my 2 cents.
I don't know how to approach that one, because I think honestly what you're saying to me is you're comfortable with it. And the way that I'm making, I think, what could be a more neutral argument, in that I could make you really uncomfortable with it if I replaced her with someone else that did the exact same thing with the curriculum, but did it, say, like from Ann Coulter's point of view, for instance. And it was, I mean, because honestly, to be very honest with you, now there's a competing project to this that now I'm also criticizing, right? So I'm criticizing now the 1776 version
which isn't a curriculum, Chris. It's not, and it's
but this is my point. This is my point, Jen. I could put both of those on the table and have the same problem with both.
No. One's and I'm not a history teacher, like I said, but like I love that.
You keep prefacing that. But in this discussion, you're white, Jay. That's what matters in this discussion. So
we haven't even got to white people yet. I'd love to. Let's. But as far as curriculum goes, it was a beautiful lesson plan, and I was struck. I hadn't actually looked at it until today when Jen sent it, and I was struck by like the first thing was reading the Declaration and like answering these questions about the Declaration, and they did not appear to me to be leading questions at all. Now I'm a pretty left guy, right? So like I know that a right-leaning teacher, especially a white guy, is gonna like read that document different than me. I get it, but like I thought it was a really like excellent lesson plan and even-handed and open-ended and inquiry-based and all the things Jen said. And the 1776 project is a T-shirt and a hashtag. Those are totally like different things.
And a slide deck.
Yeah.
And Chris, your point about comfort and discomfort, I am comfortable with this as a curriculum designer. I am comfortable because it doesn't supplant, it supplements. If you are a teacher and your students are asking about the 1690 project and you want a structure to talk about it with your students, this gives you a structure and immediately says, go to the founding documents of these United States and look at those, do paired text. As a white person, and we're not quite there yet, but it is deeply discomfortable because it says, what does it mean to be someone who has benefited from generations of trauma? And it doesn't say that here, but it invites students to think about that where they are. So one of the questions is, what is national memory? That's a question. And there is that how the three of us would answer that would be very different, which is the hallmark of a quality inquiry question in a curriculum that's asking students to interrogate their identity and their understanding of American slavery. Yeah. So what is our story? And one of the things that I shared with the two of you, that I'm a moderator and Ask Historians, and I get a lot of questions. I take all the questions about the history of American education, and we get a lot of questions about why do we learn so much about Christopher Columbus, and why don't I learn about this, and why do we learn about that? And so one of the patterns that I have people understand is a concept called Americana. And Americana is George Washington and the cherry tree. It's Lincoln and his log cabin. It's, all these, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It's these simplified kernels. And what 1619 does is disrupt Americana. And it takes those stories that we're so used to hearing in American history and says, let's shift how we think about Americana to start from the moment of that foot sinking into the sand on the Virginia beach in 1619. And part of asking that question is, if we start at that foot, we ignore all of the trauma that was caused to the indigenous people of this continent. We ignore what happened, but we miss what happens along the southern border, what happened to the indigenous Mexican people, what happened to Mexicans as the borders moved. So it's not to say this is 1619 is the right starting point. It's what happens when we center Black Americans.
I mean, you're seeing that as the main question of this, is like what happens when we center Black Americans rather than what happens when we reassess 1619 as a starting point for what we consider to be America today.
I think those are the same questions, because we're not saying 1619 is that, and to break what I asked for before, if Nicole Hannah-Jones, the woman, wants to say, I believe that America started on 1619, that is her claim to make. And I saw indigenous scholars saying to her, here are the consequences of that statement, we can talk about that. And that was some of the pushback from indigenous scholars. But if we say, what happens if, that is deeply discomforting for white Americans, because we are used to July 4th, 1776. It is, I would hope, and empowering to a certain extent to Black students who are learning this content, because it puts them at the center of America. and I won't presume to speak for what it's like to be a Black student sitting in a classroom learning experience, but instead of the lens being on dead white men, it is on following the path of Black Americans. So it's, what if we do that?
Okay. So I don't know how to get around this one, because I think my only point about vetting of curriculum is, I think it's not just curriculum, but adoptions, period. Curriculum adoptions as a process and a function of schools and a function of schooling. To me, whether I agree with what she's wrote or whether I believe that it's the right approach in the Pulitzer's version of this or whatnot, I'm still pretty excited about school districts maintaining some system. The thing that I talk around all the time about, like, schools being a place of culture war between people, I'm really sick of fighting each other. And the idea that, like, I could move from Minneapolis to a rural area, and the way that this stuff goes down in districts, the point of view can change like overnight from one school to the other. And that a lot of it can have nothing to do with an educative process or a system, and has everything to do with politics. And now, I think on a national level, with Trump getting involved in this and seeing this as an issue, this is exactly the politicization of something, to me, that should be much more, I think, structured than this right now. And I think it's going to be a catastrophe, just in ways that, like, bother me a lot, because I don't think it's going to be about facts. I think a lot of it is going to be about ideology. And I do think that ideology is something that you're not going to be able to detect if you're on the 1776 side pushing 1776, or if you're on the 1619 side pushing 1619. The idea that ideology and a point that you're like, one is trying to actually make a long love letter to the idea of reparations. It is not trying to teach you factual history about the contributions about Blacks in the United States. So I don't know if we should stick with the curriculum part. We could, but the first claim that I make that really bothers me the most is really at the basis of everything that I feel is most dangerous about the project.
Well, let's come back to that, but can I ask you one question?
Yeah.
Can we agree that can we agree that schools should be, history classes should be talking more about pre-1776 America in the context of slavery and what slavery did to this country and the foundational nature of it? And can we agree, and I certainly, as a white person, like, I grew up learning almost nothing about that. I know times have changed a little bit, but they really haven't changed all that much everywhere. And so can we agree that, well, one, can we agree that? And then two, could you possibly see a case that, yeah, maybe this was an imperfect effort or whatever, but could it possibly have moved the Overton window or whatever to make it possible for us to get more of that conversation in? Because again, talking about like, even this word curriculum makes it sound like there's like a whole year's worth of 1619 stuff out there that's like just waiting to get jammed into a class. Like, we're talking a couple lesson plans here or there. Which
I do want to push, Jay, I do want to keep pushing back on this one point though.
Okay.
I think you would be less flippant about that part.
Which part?
That it's not that big a deal. It's not that long of a curriculum. It's not that long a time. I think you would feel differently about that if it was coming from a source that you didn't trust had the best interests of people at heart, no matter how generic it seemed. It could seem like totally just like, all we're talking about are the dates of the Constitution. Everybody knows. I just a day or so ago watched, like, from Hillsdale College, which I don't know enough about it, but I guess I should learn more about who they are. Like their take on, like, the Constitution and what was behind it or whatnot. And I swear to God, I can show you this video of them talking, very well produced too, by the way. There's like the guy sitting in what looks to be like a Thomas Jefferson cabin with, like, you know, audible, like really ambient light and shit, and just like a Bible sitting out and all kinds of just, it's beautiful. Like, it's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I felt kind of gross, like, watching it, because it almost felt like, you know, that part of Disneyland where you feel like, yeah, you guys are acting. But anyways, there was like, I probably couldn't take apart what he was saying about the Constitution in a way where I could really challenge. It was, a lot of it was very generic, but there was a point of view there, and it was driving me crazy. I was, like, able to detect it. I was able to say, you're going to say that this is all just like basic generic facts stuff that you're talking about here, whatnot, but I get your right wing take on this. I can see it. Like, I can see through what you're saying to me or whatnot, which means that person could pretty it up any way he wanted to and bring it to a school or a school district. In my school district, and I'd probably fight him on it, right? And I think you would too. If I called you and said, Jay, you got to see this, like this video of this guy or whatnot, you would probably, and Jen, I know Jen would, because when I said Hillsdale, you went, yeah.
I made a face there. I didn't cover that well.
Yeah. So I understand your critique there in terms of like Jen and I's comfort with this is obviously based on where we're situated, and that thus like maybe that it makes like that biases our opinion in a way that like turns this from something less than data into more of anecdote. However, I'm like very comfortable stating this fact that most white Americans have ignored the history and repercussions of slavery for time out of mind. And anything that can be done to like shake that birdcage to me is a good thing. Even if Nicole Hannah, and again, I'm sorry to bring her name up, Jen, because I'm not trying to rattle her,
sure.
But even if the World Socialist website article is like right, and the New York Post is right, and she did this and she deleted all these tweets, and maybe all this is true, and like there is something insidious about that, but still like shaking that birdcage of white people so that they have to reckon with this, to me is a good thing, even if it ends up with us having to backtrack a little bit.
Well, Jen, let's let you in here.
Well, one of the pieces of the 1619 project, it's not in the main PDF, but what it is the history. I didn't mean to open it to such a graphic image. I apologize. I don't know if my camera's able to get it, but it's they're manacles for a child.
Participate.
Thank you for censoring, camera. But one of the pieces is on why we're so bad at teaching, we collectively in the United States, about teaching the history of slavery in schools. So part of the project is saying we haven't done a good job teaching the history of slavery in schools, and they get into the Daughters of the Confederacy and the Lost Cause narrative. And so part of the project is saying, it's the Nikita Stewart piece. Why can't we teach this? And it's recognizing that we're not doing a good job teaching. So to echo Jay's point, even if all this project accomplishes was getting everyone collectively to think that America started before 1776, that's a good thing.
So Chris, let's come back to now your first point from the email that you may or may not have found, the one you sent to Jen and I. And it was this, you had
well, wait a second too.
Okay.
I want to ask Jen about this last point. I don't come back to this again. So I think you said earlier that you assert that white people literally believe something about 1776 that I don't know 100%. That isn't true. And that this recontextualizes 1619 in a way that is more true than 1776. So what is that thing?
Not necessarily more true. I think what it does is it complicates it. It disrupts the narrative of Americana, where for generations we have been teaching children in school that America started July 4th, 1776. It was a group of men. They were righteous patriots. They believed in all of these things. And eventually we would get to a place where everyone would be equal, and that's what we're constantly working towards.
And if I can interrupt real quick, just to reference Adam, whatever his name is from the Atlantic, he brought up white people's favorite black scholar, Martin Luther King, and he said that white people love this story of the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And that is the story Jen's describing, that white people like believe in our bones that, yeah, it wasn't perfect in 1776, but we were headed there. So,
exactly. And so what the 1619 Project does is invite us to say, what if really what if that's an oversimplification of who we are as a country? Mm-hmm. What if instead of thinking of it that way, we thought of it instead as we built with our ancestors, our white ancestors' hands, enslaved Black children. And that's how we formed a nation, through the pain and the trauma of Black Americans. And we keep ignoring what they're saying. We keep making them have to fight for everything that we take for granted. And it's not, I've never once picked up a sense of white guilt. I think the pieces that I've read have been optimistic in a sense of here are things that we can do. So I hear what you're saying. You mentioned reparations. So I don't think it's about we need to be guilty as white Americans. It's more we have to tell a more fuller story. And so what 1619 does is blow open the narrow history we've too often been repeating generation after generation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not so much about what's more true and less true, because like you said in your video, Chris, the truth is a group of Africans arrived in what would become Virginia on this August date in 1620 or 1619, and everyone pretty much agrees they were enslaved. Though some historians disagree and think actually they were more like chattels, they were more like indentured servants, and they merged into the community. Historiography, they'll disagree on that. So the facts aren't disputed. So we can't say, well, no, really, actually, it was December 1st, 1619, versus August 20th, 1619. We know 1619. So we're not debating those facts. It's how do we conceive of America? And that's not a matter of dates and people. That's an idea.
So here's a central problem. Even as we're talking about it, it's actually happening in real time as we're talking about it. I feel like the New York Times, its editor, and Nicole Hannah-Jones moved the goalpost multiple times on what this is and what it's supposed to be. And they did it in a way that was dismissive of a range of critics that were basically making everything from very sober, level-headed, middle-of-the-road requests for corrections to some major revisions. And even when they did make first of all, they refused to make any corrections until the Pulitzer was acquired. Before the Pulitzer was acquired, they refused all calls and requests. And we probably would not be talking about this right now if they actually had responded differently to a range of scholars that were contacting them publicly and privately to just tell them this would be so much better if you would just tie up this thing. In some cases, I thought that there was more to it. There was some visceral stuff happening with some people that wanted to attack it, and in other cases there were little sweethearts that actually are like little leather patch professorial people who were just asking for some small little things that they thought would make a difference, and they were doing it very kindly and whatnot. And the way that they were treated and dismissed said a lot, because the New York Times would not budge until the Pulitzer was won. So let me go to my. Go ahead.
Chris, I apologize. Yeah. I'm not.
Jen, do not apologize for that. Man.
Yeah,
don't do it.
That was very white lady. Yeah. I don't think that's accurate. Okay, so I did a timeline, and my understanding is the project was released August 20th, and it looks like the Pulitzer was awarded on May 4th.
2000. You're talking 2020, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so. The project is
article that we were talking about that came out on the Twitter that started this whole conversation that we're having right now is when they made the revision that people wanted them to make.
Okay, so wait, the project came out August 18th, 2019.
2019.
Okay, so August 19th, 2019, the project came out. On when was okay, so if I'm looking, the first round of corrections the first round of feedback where the letter was released from the historians, those 4 historians, was December 20th, 2019. On December 24th, 2019, that's the Atlantic article where Nicole said, she said, I hear and accept the criticism in that Atlantic article. And she said, if it goes to your curriculum, we will revise it. So that's December. So in December, Nicole says, I hear the feedback. They publish the letter, they respond to it. In March 11th, 2020, Silverstein, who I assume is the editor of the New York Times project, March 11th, 2020, they issue the correction. They publish the letter from the historian who raised the greatest amount of concerns. They give a bunch of thank yous to historians. They make the change. And the change goes from a primary cause of the revolution was the institution of slavery to some of the people who supported the revolution were worried about slavery. So they changed that.
Which, if I could just interrupt real quick, just for clarification, I think that claim about the revolution was the just the big one. It was
the big one.
The right had a lot of objections about a lot of things that we can get to if we have time, but like the big one that across political ideologies was that claim you just mentioned. That they changed.
Okay.
Which she changed. So she acknowledged.
And I just want to say this: her saying that "and some" was not seen as a correction by those very same folks, because and here's why. From left to right, it wasn't a right-wing thing. Because that's still not the correction. It was not the basis, period, there is no evidence, historic evidence, period, that it was at all part of the thing. And let me finish just like on this one point about this, because it's important. To say that change it to some folks, it was for some folks, is the same, it would be saying like the civil rights movement for some was about spreading communism in the United States, right? Which is what some right-wing people do. They'll say, and what they're alluding to is it was a communist movement, blah, blah, and it was still a part of the movement, blah, blah. And that is absolutely not what the civil rights movement was about. It wasn't to spread. There was some overlap with communism, blah, blah, blah. But to say some people saw the civil rights movement as a way to spread communism still leaves you that open kind of dog whistle territory to work with. That's not a correction.
The teacher would like Jen to go. Jen.
Yeah.
Go, Jen.
So it is my understanding of the historiography from those who studied the American Revolution is that there were revolutionary people who became patriots in defense of the institution of chattel slavery, particularly in the American South. And my understanding of that stems from two particular historical details. Let me find my notes. Something called the Somerset decision. And that is the extent of my understanding of it. But what we did is we had one of our historians on Ask Historians talk about how there were some Southern patriots who supported the American Revolution, who did express concern about the implications of what was happening in England on the institution of chattel slavery. So it is fair to say there is evidence in the historical record that some of the patriots expressed concern about the institution of chattel slavery and said their reason for joining the revolution was connected to their thinking about the institution. I hear what you're saying about we can't say the civil rights is about communism, but if we pulled all of the people who supported the civil rights movement in a room together, there would be people who were there because they thought the movement would spread communism. So it wasn't a reason for the civil rights movement, but there were people in the room who had that headspace, like you said. There were patriots who said, I'm going to support independence because I don't know what's going on over there in England with slavery, and I want to keep this institution running my plantation. I don't want to give up this labor pool that I have built over 2 generations.
I mean, listen, I'm not going to argue that there was probably somewhere in the South somebody who thought that.
Yeah.
I'm going to say absolutely there was somebody in the South who thought that about almost anything. They probably thought it's raining today. That's a plot to take away my slaves, right? Right. I'm not going to, but I would be very angry I have already been angry with people who write that the civil rights movement was about spreading communism. And I'm angry about it because I know it decontextualizes the reality of the totality of the evidence of the time. The overwhelming push and thrust of the civil rights movement, for instance, you could make that argument about it. Yes, you could. And you could even find ways to justify that argument. And it would be the wrong thing to teach my kids, because I know for a fact that the bigger picture, a broad cross-section from left to right of historians will tell you why it's wrong. Yeah. Like why it lacks the context that you want to tell a major story. You can't tell a major story from a tidbit of something.
Sure. And
that is only a tidbit of something. Like in that
I think
way.
you just hit on something very, very powerful there. That if we say to students, it's wrong to say that this wasn't a cause, well, that's not good historiographical practices. The historical record supports the evidence, provides evidence to support the claim. There were Southern slave owners who supported independence because of their concerns about chattel slavery. We can point to the historical record. What I want to stress, though, is Nicole didn't build a story in her essay around that. It is one line in one paragraph in one part. She then goes
Oh,
on to
now
build.
see, now this is where we're getting into some this is, and it's come so late in the program, but that to me, I cannot live with that. This was a major central thesis of her work, and they softened it.
Oh
piece
no,
by
Chris,
piece
no,
by
no,
piece.
no.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
no, 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 no,
yeah,
no,
it
wait,
was.
wait. No,
It's a
I'm gonna do
dilemma.
what
Yes,
Wallace should have. I'm gonna do what
Right.
Wallace should have done last night. Like, no.
Oh,
Like,
whatever.
you can't just say, like, what do you mean it was? How are you gonna say it was a central thesis if Jen's gonna tell
Okay,
you
let's
it's
just put it
one
this way.
line?
Okay, let's put it this way. I'm
Okay.
not gonna say it's a central part of the thesis.
Okay. First off, let me just say.
What I'm going to say is most learned, educated people who read the project, who have a background in history for a living, who range from left to right, from conservative to liberal, and some who are moderate and apolitical, they all made this criticism. I didn't make this criticism up, that it was a central part of her thesis in her very first essay that kicks off the entire thing and creates the entire umbrella. So don't put it on Chris that I said that this is. Let's just say that a very wide range of educated people who don't agree on anything else, agreed on that point.
But we have to acknowledge she fixed it. She changed the language.
Well, I mean,
she changed. I mean, whether or not she changed it sufficiently, we can deal with that.
Okay,
but I want to go back to this the timeline.
I would say no. Yeah.
The project comes out August 19th, 2019. December 20th, there's a letter from the historians. In December, several pieces come out. Hannah Jones responds to the criticism. The New York Times editors put out a piece and say, here's the evidence that we used to build that claim. We're open to more feedback. March 11th, they provide another update. They change the online piece. They announce the change, and that's established. May 4th, Hannah Jones is awarded the Pulitzer. So I don't think it's accurate to say they held off on the edits until after she got it, because the edits look like they came in March. The Pulitzer came in May.
So when you say edits, are you talking about like they made edits, like literal edits? Or are you talking about the correction? Because the correction that people were looking for is the thing that made people animated and mad. They didn't feel like they corrected the central criticisms that were given to
I think
them.
my understanding is this piece here called an update to the 1619 project. This is where they say, here's the change that we made, and we thank, and they name checked all the historians. They also did a video where 5 historians got together and talked about it. So the video is attached to it, and the video, the historians talk about the complexity of the era. So they not only made the correction, they provided the context and a video for a historian to understand the context of that era. I have not seen any evidence that people have called out factual errors in any of the pieces by historians. So including like Kevin Crouse, including, I think there's 4 different pieces by historians, by actual historians. And I don't think anyone has called out factual errors in their piece. I know the piece on capitalism did get called out, as it were.
A ton. Yeah, that one is one of and that wasn't by a historian. That one was
that's a sociologist. And that's fine, because what the sociologist did is he took a sociological perspective of capitalism as opposed to an economic. And so the economists are saying his read is wrong. And I think my understanding is that he's perfectly fine to say, okay, so, that's fine. We're not going to use that essay to teach the history of capitalism in America. We can use this essay to think about capitalism in America. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to let this one, bringing you guys on is to let you guys let it breathe and let it air. I'm going to say, what I'm going to say about that one is just, I feel like I want people to go and read all these different claims that people make and where they say the timeline is and what they ask. The socialist one is really interesting to me because, listen, everybody knows I'm not a socialist, so I have no reason to stand up and cheer with the socialists on any of this, right? So this is it's not my gig to defend the socialists. But I watched the interaction that she had with them on Twitter about it. And it was, right. What you're doing right now is super cringy in a few ways for me, though, because she basically, one of the first things she just said was, you guys are white white people, so you don't understand. And then they started getting her some of the facts, and she said, well, I never said this. And then they posted something that said that she said what she didn't say. And then she said, well, I never said it like that. And they're like, well, here's another thing that said you said it like this. So that was the interaction she was having with people about the project, rather than just doing a very journalistic-y thing, which would have been just to say, like, contact my editors, or we happily will take any criticisms you have and have our fact checkers look it over. And if we agree, we'll agree. And if we don't agree, we will agree to disagree or whatnot. That's not how she was handling it. She was doing a very,
the reason
very
I cringe,
very rock star.
And I think that's okay. I think, and I don't expect us to agree, and that's perfectly fine. I firmly believe that she has the right to respond however she wants to. And one of the challenges of Twitter is it does flatten discourse, and we have to work really, really hard to ensure we're having complex discourse. And I cannot even imagine what her mentions look like. I can't even, I get twitchy when I have 20 plus. I can't even imagine what she sees when she opens Twitter. So how she responds is a choice that she makes as a woman. It is a choice she makes as a human being, which I think is her right to make. In terms of the project, I think we have to make sure we're reading stuff that's dated after March 2020. Because if people are still talking about stuff from August 2019 in just her essay, they're neglecting all of the history and the evolution of the piece in which New York Times.
So this is a good point. I love this point, because this actually relates to my first point. And it'll be interesting to see what both of you as educators and one of you with more of a focus on history. It'll be interesting to see what you think at this point. I hate arbitrary dates in history period as a thing. It's just a thing to me, because you can stop at any point in history and start making an argument, and it could be to your advantage to place the date anywhere you want, because it will change the context of what you're arguing in some ways. When asked about why start with 1619, Nicole Hannah-Jones basically said the thing that I totally agree with her on, which was in high school, she read a book that I read that I think is very important. And it's like the seminal piece of work when it comes to rescuing Black history from white people. Before the Mayflower is this very important piece of work of Black scholarship that name checks and works with just a universe of historians to rescue Black history. And if I were going to say something to Nicole or others, and we were going to have a private meeting, and we're going to say, we get one shot to educate white people about us and about our standing in the world and about our contributions and about what we've contributed, not to this country, but to the world, period, to set people right on our humanity, like to rescue our total humanity, not our trauma story, not our story of just porn, trauma porn and all that, because that does us damage in that we gave the world math, for instance, right? So the book that she is talking about in Before the Mayflower is the book I would hand to every white teacher in America and say, have at her. Take this book, go home, and please digest it. What's interesting about that book is 1619 is the second chapter of that book. To contextualize Black people in the world and in history, the first chapter of that book is the Congo, the Nile, the Ethiopians, the Sub-Saharan Africa, the inventions, the contributions to realistic art, concepts, aesthetics and beauty, mathematics, just keep going down the line and placing Black people in a place in history that no white American ever will and does, right? So we were great before 1619 in ways of which, if you start with 1619 or 1776 or 1986 or 1865, for instance, or whatever, any of those points in time tells white people a story about us I'm not comfortable with. And I'm definitely not comfortable with white people teaching my children any concept for our lives and our contributions to this country and the world without the first chapter of Before the Mayflower as a basis for it, right? So it's very political to even start with 1619, and it's a different story. That's telling a different story. So if we were having an internal Black conversation without you guys, the conversation would be around, what do Black people want white people to know about our place in the world and in history and in America that will set white people right about how they think about us? That to me is not a small critique for me, because this is my biggest one. Really, honestly, drove me nuts that one of the responses to her work was by Rich Lowry in what is it that Rich writes
National
for?
Review.
National Review, right? And I think I've read National Review 4 times in like 20 years, right? You know, and something in it, right? And it made me so mad that he made a point in it that I had to agree with, that I could not agree with, right? And here was the point. Some of the biggest names in Black history don't make an appearance in the 1619 Project. Some of the most mammoth contributions that we have made to this society and to education, for instance, and to philosophy and to science, like our biggest contributors don't make an appearance. I find that very suspicious, that all of our trauma is in there without all of our contributions in there too, because the trauma is about white guilt, and it's about reparations, and it's about a political movement. It is not about teaching white people about us and putting us into our proper context. And I can't find a Black scholar yet who, when I asked the question, if you wanted white people to really know about Black people, what are the set of pieces of scholarship you would hand them, who said this in comparison to a long list of other stuff that we have for you guys. Like,
Chris,
go ahead.
Well, I'm gonna argue for a second. It's 1619, and I can't wait to read that book you're referencing, the before the Mayflower book. But 1619, I obviously we can agree it's just a metonym for slavery altogether, right? And could they pick a different date? Sure. Do people disagree or agree about whether they were slaves in 1619 or not? Yes. I mean, but obviously it's a pretty date because it's the year before the Mayflower, and obviously also it's a centennial year, so that's nice, right? It's just nice to do things like that, because all journalism at some point is also art, right? I mean, all writing is art at some point, so you have to appeal to a narrative, et cetera, et cetera. I'll just say this: I love, and I can't wait to read that chapter, even as much as I've learned a lot of that stuff, and having taken history of math classes, of course the history of math is completely inextricably intertwined with Egypt, and then Islam, and then back to Egypt before the Western Civ people stole it and took it, and I know all that, and there's so much there to unpack, but that's Western Civ. As an American project, like I do understand the decision not to like go back to Africa, except in so much as like 1619 required us to go to Africa for the advent of slavery. And I would also argue that, and then I'm going to pass it to Jen. Before you respond to me, I'm going to pass it to Jen. And I'm just going to argue that I think white Americans for 40 years now, since Reagan signed MLK Day into existence, we've been inundated. We've been inundated with Black History Month stories of the contributions of Black Americans. Now, are they the same story every year? Yes. Like,
yes.
Is it all?
Yes, it is.
I get it. Don't get me wrong. Is it all George Washington Carver, Jackie Robinson, and Martin Luther King? Yes.
Don't forget Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks. Yes. But are we taught about slavery? Are white people taught about slavery? And the answer is a resounding no. And so is Nicole Hannah-Jones blurring the line between journalist and public intellectual and having a hard time with that? Probably. Like, it seems evident that she is. Like, and that we don't have a history of public intellectuals here in America the way they do in like France. But she's bored. She's like going back and forth between that and like deleted some tweets, et cetera, et cetera. Did she do a good thing for white people? I think yes, and I hear you that term trauma porn, and I am uncomfortable like thinking that like am I triggered by being like, oh, trauma porn? Like I don't want to enjoy it, but I do want to, as you and I have talked about many times before, I want to understand and lament, and without that visceral history, it's hard for me to do that. So I'm gonna pass it to Jen before you get to say something.
So, Kristen, what will come as no surprise to you? One of the greatest talents for Jay and Mai's people is one of the greatest kind of strengths of whiteness is the ability to find the comfort lane. And if we start the history of Black people in America, in Africa, the history we're going to find is, did you know that tribes were selling slaves amongst each other? The reason we had the transatlantic slave trade was because it started in Africa. And so it wasn't white people who took Africans from their homes. It was Africans giving them to us.
And I'm going to interrupt. I'm sorry, Jen, but just to say that every time I talk to a right-wing person about slavery, that is a talking point. They pull it out of their wallet. It must be on the card they print and hand to the right-wing people because they all know it.
And you know what? And I will say this, and they should read Before the Mayflower, because it puts it in context form where you can't come away with that from reading the first chapter of Before the Mayflower.
So go back, Jen. I'm just like,
it's a common talking point. But if we go to the nature of curriculum and what it is we want something to accomplish, we have to have some sort of boundaries. So understanding the history of Africans, of African Americans, of Black Americans, I would hope that would start in kindergarten, where children are reading picture books about the civilizations of Africa, where when they are learning about great scientists through time, there are always Black faces amongst those pictures. They're always hearing how it is not a matter of less civilization and more civilization. It is different civilizations. And so from kindergarten, children are hearing the message that the Africans, invented algebra, that they are hearing these messages. So by time they get to American history, by the time they start to say, okay, I've learned about me, I've learned about my family, I've learned about my town, I've learned about my state. Now I'm going to learn about my country. Teachers have a choice. Where do we start that story? What story do we tell them to help them understand who America is? Because remember, let's say they start American history in 5th grade. They have now done 180 days a year when they're in school of every day standing up and saying the pledge. So for 180 days, or sitting down, or remaining there quietly, they've heard this phrase over and over and over again about this country. So we get to American history. Do we start July 4th? Or do we start, in 1619? Do we start 1492? And I think there are a whole bunch of different conversations to have about that. And what was accomplished with the 1619 project is that it stretched our thinking. It didn't give whiteness a lane. Because even if we escape into white guilt, which does feel very comfortable to progressives, even if we go to white guilt, there's nowhere to go from there. You can't really stay there. It's okay. So, what do I do with that information? So the 1619 project gives us poetry we can read. It gives us a photo essay called Hope. It talks about Black inventors through American history. It talks about not the great people we learn about in February, Black History Month, but it talks about how we hear the history of Black Americans in the music we listen to on the radio, in dozens and dozens of ways. So the project isn't perfect, because no project can be. I think they fixed the most glaring issue and hopefully took that off the table. But it gives us a place to start with students and say, here is an essay written by a woman who struggled with what it means to be a Black woman in America, who couldn't understand her father's patriotism. So let's read this essay about what does it mean to be patriotic in a country that doesn't seem to want you to be here, but can't exist without you. And now let's read the Declaration of Independence. What do you notice? What observations, what patterns do you see? What overlaps do you see? And I think if the 1619 project does nothing but stretch or kind of eliminate this idea of white comfort around American history, it moves us towards educating white adults who are better educated than previous generations in a way we haven't had before, is my closing argument.
Chris?
Oh, Chris, you're muted.
I was making the best argument. I just wrapped it all up. It was the best that I had ever said all night long too. So let me just say that. So my first argument, honestly, is my biggest problem with the project is I care about context. I care about breadth like depth and breadth, and I care about what's the essential story you're trying to teach and who's the audience. Which audience are you trying to teach something? The thing about Before the Mayflower to me is I don't think it's lost to history. It is a starting point. It is not, and it is what caused her to want to do this. She says she attributes the desire to do this to Before the Mayflower, and you don't have to pretty that up for a new audience today. You don't need, I didn't mention this at all today. I do have a problem with a multinational corporation selling our story to just a hungry and thirsty large cross section of white people who feel like they've found their Jesus and they're just going to take this thing and suck it down and go and bring it into classrooms. That's a really callous way that I just said that. Yeah. It should be said that goes to how I feel about that, right? Because Before the Mayflower came out of a long series of articles by Black scholars in the Black Power movement through Ebony magazine. And the audience was for Black people. It was to educate Black people about themselves as part of the Black Power movement so that they themselves would know how to interact in a society that didn't love them. Right. And this flips it on its head. It's almost like Elvis finding an old, like record from Muddy Waters and creating a new version of it. Right. Because this was taking that seminal work, that beautiful work that was done before, where it was done in a Black publication to Black people as the audience for the purpose of educating Black people with their real story beyond slavery. Not slavery. Slavery, Sharif El-Mekki says this to me all the time. Slavery is an interruption of Black history. It's not Black history. And white people conflate slavery and Black history as the same thing. So when we teach white people about slavery, they really believe we're teaching them about Black history. And that's a problem for me. So,
well, let me say, I think what white people need to learn, because you're absolutely right. Like I love that quote from El-Mekki, and slavery is an interruption in Black history. But what white people need to learn, and what 1619 like at least brought back to attention, is the fact that slavery is inextricable from American history, right? Yeah. Now, not forget Black history like globally. I just mean like let me put that aside for a second, bracket it, and just say like American history is inexplicable without slavery. And we've got to be having that conversation. If you want to say it's about reparations, great. I'd love to have that conversation too.
Well, in a way, I do think it's about reparations, which is up for grabs in terms of like in intellectual service circles, people will argue for and against. But the problem to me of these things do come to power imbalance. If white people are taught about Black people constantly in the context of American slavery, I don't think it does anything to break down white supremacy. All I think it does is call white people to continuously see us as a passive actor in history, of which we could be made better or worse by the actions of white people. If they accept us, or if they have some sort of penance, or they do something, it will change us from being non-agentic people to being agentic people suddenly. And I do think that first chapter is a big part of the problem. Missing that first chapter is a big part of the problem. No.
The aim, again, to quote the 1619 Project, the aim is to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contribution, blah, blah.
Okay, let me finish then. I'm going to wrap it then. Let me just say this. Yep. I don't think it does that. I think what it does, fair. Yeah, what I think it does is it adds another chapter to the slavery story, which I call trauma porn, that white people love. And they love it because it empowers them more than it actually demands anything of them. And it actually gives them an out. If I just believe and understand slavery a little bit more, I'll be a better white person. And I will say this, it's not factual. Those people who got off the boat in 1619, what you will learn from Before the Mayflower is there was a niggerization process that took place between slavery being identified as a lifelong condition of Blackness. So when they got off the boat, that did not become true for at least another 60 or 70 years or more. And what's missing in that context is important, because Black slave owners, interracial marriages between whites and Blacks before the racialization of slavery in the United States, Black businesses, all have been washed from history in this idea that we as Black people came to America only as racialized slaves. It's almost like people not understanding that Republicans of the past were not the same Republicans today. Slavery existed in the world forever. It was an old thing by the time those slaves got here. But racialized eugenicist slavery in the United States went through a process over decades. And that process, I don't think that white people know that there were free Black people in the United States before there became a need to actually racialize slavery to the point where Blacks would be lifelong. That's an important part of the history too, because we built things, we did things, we had things prior to becoming slaves, right? We weren't just off the boat from Africa into racialized slavery, right?
And this will be the last thing I say. This will be the last thing I say, because I know we're over on time, and then I'll let y'all close. But to me, what you just said is just a huge important part of the terrible original sin of America, is that I know slavery has existed time out of mind, and I know that probably those Africans in 1619 were sold from Black warlords in Africa. I get all that, but we took it. I realize it took us 70 years, but we turned it from something it was into something it wasn't. Which what it wasn't was the eugenicist was just the best word, and I'll just leave it at that. So like, it's back to something Jen said. Then I'm done. 1619. It's just an essay that got turned into a podcast, that got turned into a little bit of a mini movement. They can't do everything. And so maybe the best thing we could do is just say everyone should go read that book and like know more. So I'm out. I'm gonna let Jen close.
Yeah, Jen, we'll let you close on it. I actually don't think people go read that book, because I do think that people need a Beyonce of something to get them interested in pop culture.
I'm gonna read the book.
Like pop cultural things. Like that's what it like this is about, like psychology. Pop psychology is very alluring to people more than psychology is, for a reason. And that's what I think this is. This is popular history for people who actually don't want to do the hard work of actually really learning about us. That's what this is. In my mind, that's what this is. This is popular, sold by a multinational corporation to unsuspecting people who on any other day would be against multicultural, multinational corporations putting out stuff that gets into schools like the next day, right? Without any type of vetting. But Jen, the floor is yours. I brought you here because I felt like you were going to bring the heat to me and you're going to put me on fire, man.
Okay, so
do it.
3 things I'm going to invite you, if I may, to stop saying. First, I'm going to invite you to stop saying that the correction was made after the Pulitzer. I believe it was done beforehand, and I think we have the dates to say that. Second, the idea that there is no vetting of the curriculum, I don't think that's fair to say, because I don't want to say there's nothing to vet, but the tasks that the curriculum asks teachers to do is to look at the Declaration of Independence. So if your concern is to vet the Declaration, that's something different. And the third piece I want to kind of offer, and I can only speak for myself and the white women that I work with and interact with around whiteness. Your concern, perfectly valid, perfectly understandable, is that this will do nothing but make us feel better about action, or feel better, or feel worse, or just feel. We'll be caught up in our feels. What I want to offer is that the takeaway from a lot of this is the lesson we need to learn from 1619 is that we have an obligation as white Americans to listen to Black Americans. And in a practical sense, what that means for me as someone who is pro-choice is to step away from the white feminism of the pro-choice movement and step towards the reproductive justice movement, which was founded by Black women, by the Sister Song movement, so that my actions aren't about pro-choice, which is very white feminism. They're about reproductive justice. And so my political work, and if I do donations, that I'm oriented in that direction. So the message that I'm taking away as an adult, which is going to be different, I think, than most students will take away, is that I have an obligation as a white American to listen to Black Americans. And because I am a feminist, that means I have an obligation to listen to Black women and to learn from what they are advocating in terms of justice, in terms of whether it's reproduction, whether it's abortion, whether it's families, whether it's education. That is where I need to orient myself. I cannot claim that a lot of women got that message. I cannot speak for any other group of white Americans, but I do want to offer, if I may, that the takeaway is we can't keep listening. We have to to kind of summarize it, we have to have gender loyalty over race loyalty. And 1619, I think the pieces, especially the one on health insurance, or the history of health insurance, brings home that message. I think for many white American women, that the collective awakening is that we have to attend to gender loyalty over race loyalty. And I think 1619 helps bring that into reality.
Okay, so say the 3 points again. There were 3 points. Stop
saying that they waited till after the Pulitzer. They corrected it beforehand. Please stop saying.
I don't know if I can do that one.
I can lay out the dates. I'll send you the dates.
Yeah, send them to me, because this is why I don't think because the criticism of them was that they were not being responsive to the actual corrections that they were being asked for. And they, even in some cases, if you look, and I put the link for people to go look at with the timeline from the socialists, for instance, they made silent edits that they never told anybody that they made, and that couldn't be found. But those edits weren't the corrections that people were being asked
right, because the actual correction that needed to be made was to that paragraph in Nicole Hannah-Jones' essay. That's the one that came out in March, and that's the one where they did the big whole an update to the 1619 project. That's when they filmed the video. So that was in March. The small edits, I think people just keep pulling from different web pages because there's so many different web pages. Second thing, the issue of vetting.
First one on that one, I want people to go look at the record and take away from it what you can, because there is such a wide range of scholars that are on record about this exact point, that I want people to actually do what historians should do. Go to the primary sources of what people are actually asking for in terms of corrections and edits.
And make sure to use the Internet Wayback Machine. When you're looking at, check out the Internet Wayback Machine.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, what was the second one?
Second thing, the issue of vetting the curriculum. I don't think the curriculum is as comprehensive as your use of language implies. It is not drop into the classroom, make the photocopies, give it to kids, and just teach it. It does require preparation, and that includes getting primary sources. So I'd invite you to let go of your concerns about vetting, because I don't think that
either. So Jen, I got to fight you on this one too. And here's why. It's because this came out on a day, and in 24 hours they couldn't pull any more copies down. The New York Times was selling it, and they had sold out. And then when they actually got around to actually doing new copies or whatnot, they sold out again. And then they put it through the Pulitzer system, right? And that's the Pulitzer Center. And then you could get it for free, and you can download it for free there. As they were selling out of this in the first and the second wave or whatnot, teachers literally were online talking about, I can't wait to use this on Monday. Right, I can't wait to bring this to class next week.
But that's not the curriculum. That's teachers saying, I just want to use this.
No, that was the curriculum. That was the first versions of the curriculum. The very first, you could buy, actually, in the very first analysis, on the first day, you could buy like the packets, and people were actually buying and downloading packets. And then the curriculum, which you can get now free, actually wasn't the thing yet. So in the very beginning, teachers were actually like pining for this, taking it down and saying and posting everywhere, I can't wait to try this out next week, which was where some of my first alarm bells went off, because I was like, what do you mean you can't wait to use this in your class next week? This is the New York Times. This is like a major, this has got catastrophe written all over it. Don't do that, right? Like, take a look at it first, maybe talk to your unions or talk to somebody. Anyways. So
I think that's a whole nother.
Maybe I can stop saying the vetting thing. Yeah.
Okay. So
okay.
Piece
so first, one and two.
Yeah, so the vetting thing, and Buffalo Public Schools, I forgot to mention this before, Buffalo Public Schools adopted the curriculum and embedded it into the high school participation in government courses. And a good friend of mine teaches PIG, and they just used articles and they embedded it into the New York State PIG curriculum. So it wasn't like they just printed it off and gave it to students. The third piece is that I have seen evidence amongst white women that what 1690 Project did is reinforce the message to shift towards gender loyalty over race loyalty. Now, whether or not you have no obligation to believe that or trust that, I have seen, I think donation patterns have spoken to that. In recent history, a lot of white women are shifting from groups like Planned Parenthood towards Black doula organizations, towards reproductive justice organizations. So there's evidence that there's shifting in the habits of, I can't speak to white men, but among white women who identify as feminists.
What about you, Jay? Looking kind of suspicious there, Jay. You looking suspicious, man.
White men are not going to save us anytime soon. So let's.
All right. Well, listen. This is to me, I feel healthy, and it's healthy in this way. Is like, even when I don't feel like I'm going to win on any of these points or these issues, I still have the same intellectual kind of problem, but it's the same process though, which is to continue looking into sources and just digging. Everything that I said to you and everything I put in that video was a part of a process of not stopping listening to what different people were saying, like to continue like listening. And there's, like I said, I have a problem with most of the people in that video. I don't know if you caught it, but like, I have a thing I agree with, and then the thing they say that I think is really crazy and off the rails about Nicole Anna Jones and the project, right? So I think like everybody has the ability to be wrong in this one. I think my main point that I'll just make about it is I don't feel like I'm the intended audience. I don't think a parent with kids of color at home that are worried about the fact that their schools aren't teaching them their real history and their real place in the world is the actual audience for the 1619 project. I actually think white people are the audience for this, and white people's children are the audience, and it's centered on whiteness and what white people need to learn and know and whatnot. But for me, when I send my kids to a classroom full of white kids that are sitting there that might need something different than my need, I see teachers making my kids dumber about their own history and their place in the world and their context, because media does enough of that for them. Media tells them that they were just invented in a laboratory in America at some point before that, they hadn't done anything really important in the world. And even after we were here in America, it tells them that they didn't do much of an important, except for the stuff that you guys talked about that we learned in February every year, that, you know, a woman was tired on a bus and she sat down once, right? You know, like it doesn't even talk about the fact. Here's my favorite part even about that, because this goes to my issue. She was tired from work, so she sat down. Doesn't say anything about she had been spending a decade investigating rapes across the American South, and that the original push for all of this was rape. That was the push for Rosa Parks, and that was her claim to fame. And she worked on some of the most notable cases. No, she was tired. She sat down. Something. That's the story my kids will be taught about us, right? Like, in a classroom full of white kids, I think it's doing damage to them too. Yeah. You know, let me not say it's not doing damage to the white kids, but it's really doing damage to my kids, because the rest of the year they really don't see themselves as heroes or winners, or I don't know. Jay, were you jumping in there? I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say there's so much to go there, because I hear exactly what you're saying about and the trauma of largely white teachers teaching this, right? I mean, like, you know, the 80% of teachers out there are white, and they're the ones snatching up the copies, and so there's some problems there. I think what we can all agree, the three of us, is that in the same way that we have a year of European history for most high school students, we could definitely do with a year of African history, or we could split that year in half if we needed to between European and African history, because and this is the kind of the sine qua non of this whole thing, is that the history of Black people, whatever that kind of means, is the history of America also. So like in the same way we teach the history of Europe, we should be teaching the history of Africa. Is this imperfect? Sure. But does it like toss the ball further down the road? Like maybe. So maybe that's a good thing.
And maybe all three of us will agree on this. Like, I'm saying this about Black people and Black history because I have a biracial family, and we have to like pull from a lot of different, we have to spend extra money on materials in my household, just in general, to make sure my kids are educated. We can't rely on just what they're getting elsewhere. But the thing that I just said about Rosa Parks, it occurs to me that you could say that about a lot of the figures that they learn about in white history, as a matter of fact, too. Like, what they don't know about notable white figures in history actually could fill volumes, right?
That's Americana.
That's what you were calling Americana earlier. Well, and before we go, so Americana is like the I did not tell a lie or chop down the cherry tree stuff or whatever.
It's simplified narratives related to American history. So it's only learning about Black Americans in February. It's learning about the founding fathers. It's taking the complex history and narrowing it down to its smallest, most simplified kernel, which dehumanizes the people that we're talking about.
Gotcha. Well, I grew up on that then. I just want you to know. Well, I grew up on that. With white history, I grew up on that. I had very Afrocentric, a Black dad who gave me like other references, but the Saturday morning 1970s, 80s, you know, stuff around Thomas Jefferson and, you know, the the key. All I remember is Benjamin Franklin having a key and going outside
yeah.
or something, you know. So,
All that stuff. Yeah.
well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate.
Thank you.
You guys, awesome. You came with the goods.
Yes, I've got all my notes and I'm ready to go. It's ready to go.
Well, if you want to come back, please come back because I feel like I need interventions on a more regular basis. So anytime. But actually, I think what you brought was vital and useful because it wasn't just agreeing just to agree, and you came with receipts. So I will actually ask my listeners go out and do what Jenn said. Look at the on things. I keep saying this thing around the vetting and all that stuff. So look into it. I encourage people to do it. So,
and if ever you want to talk
final thing, Jay, for you.
No, I've already closed like 3 times, so I'm good.
Okay, if ever you want to talk about white womanhood and teaching, I'm always on board for that conversation.
2 weeks from now, let's do it. That sounds good.
I was about to say, we're going to have you back to talk about that. I just discovered, Jay and I both just discovered this site that you have on the work that you're doing now. So I kind of fell down a rabbit hole and thought it would be real interesting to get into some more of these other issues. So why don't we do that? Do you want to come back in 2 weeks?
I'm in.
All right. Awesome. All right. For everybody watching and listening, thank you guys for all the comments. I see some of you put resources into the comments. Michelle Johnson, thank you so much for putting the Zen projects before the Mayflower curriculum in because I forgot about the Zen project has that curriculum for teachers in places like Oakland and elsewhere. They are using it. So I appreciate that. And all you guys watching, spending the night with us. Thank you guys.